is so rare to be on a growth stage talking about government regulation and having to work with government sales. But we are here today with one of the best, Trae Stephens, who's a partner at Founders Fund, who is the co-founder of Anduril Industries, a computer vision and AI company solving the most difficult defense and national security issues. So I want to just dive right into the origin story of Anduril because I think it's pretty unique. You were at Founders Fund for a few years and you had tasked yourself with finding the best government and the best defense companies, and you couldn't find one that you really liked, so you decided to start your own.
Yeah, that's right. So I started my career in the intelligence community and kind of thought that I was going to be working as a civilian in the government for my entire career. Ended up kind of burning out on bureaucracy and joined Palantir, which most of you probably heard of, really early stage, and ended up kind of running the sales function for Palantir for 6 years. And so when I came to Founders Fund, the goal was go out and find the next big tech company focused on the government that we can invest in. And so I laid out this very clear strategy for how I was going to do this. There's a website called FedBizOps that has all of the government RFPs posted on it. And the VC database is called PitchBook, where you can look up fundraising history for companies. And so I pulled all of the names for anyone who had bid on a federal contract from FedBizOps, and then I ran that list against PitchBook to find out which of them had received any sort of venture capital funding. There were just over 100, and I started kind of meticulously going through and meeting with as many companies as I could. And I found a lot of really weird things. The first is that since the end of the Cold War, there have only been 2 companies that have reached a multi-billion-dollar valuation doing the majority of their business with the government. Any guesses? 2, that's it. Raytheon? Raytheon's way older, way older than the Cold War. Well, I already said one of them, Palantir. Any guesses at the other one? SpaceX. That's it. Palantir and SpaceX are the only 2 companies since the end of the Cold War that have reached multi-billion-dollar valuations doing the majority of their business for the government. Luckily for Founders Fund, we were one of the largest investors in both of those companies, so we had some background. But I basically went through this whole process and realized that there were no other company. There was no next Palantir or SpaceX. In fact, there were no companies that I had a high level of conviction in that were worth investing. So I circled up with a group of friends and started talking about what we thought that company should look like if it were to exist, and settled on autonomous systems and applied AI, so computer vision and machine learning, specifically for national security. So with Palmer Luckey, who's the founder and inventor of Oculus, and Brian Schimpf, the director of engineering at Palantir, we came together and started Anduril in June of 2017.
Yeah. And so it's been 2 years now. What are some of your greatest learnings about building a company from scratch that's solely focused on working with government?
Well, I mean, the first lesson that I always remind people of is that this is really hard. This is not a easily metrixed business. It's not something that you can just kind of fall into. And most of the advice that companies get about doing work with the government is wrong. So if you pay a consultant to tell you how to do this, you're usually going to be wrong. And there are basically 3 different aspects that are important to building a business that works, from what I've found. The first is that you need to have a product focus. So you have to build something and then sell that something to the government. This sounds super obvious, but this actually isn't how the government buys technology generally. What they like doing is telling you exactly what it is in thousands of requirements that they want, and then they bid out a contract for someone to build that thing. But anyone who's worked with technology before knows that this isn't how it works. You don't get to decide what the future looks like in 10 years and then build towards it incrementally over years and years and years with engineers working on site. You have to have the vision to build the thing that works and then convince them to buy it. And this is what both Palantir and SpaceX did that I think made them really valuable. The second thing is that you have to be aggressive in vertical integration of whatever it is that you're doing. You can't outsource a bunch of tasks on subcontracts. And so the second piece of advice that companies commonly get in this space is go and partner with Boeing, Raytheon, Accenture, Deloitte, Booz Allen Hamilton, and get on one of their contracts and then execute some piece of the work. And it turns out this doesn't work at all. You can't build a meaningful business unless you own all aspects of the execution of the product that you've built. And the third thing, by the way, those are both common of SpaceX and Palantir. The third thing is also a commonality of SpaceX and Palantir. And I'm going to you guys did terrible with the first question, but I'll ask you another question and see how it goes. What's another commonality of SpaceX and Palantir that's super obvious, but you probably haven't thought about before? That's a good entry point to the answer, which is they're both founded by billionaires. So why is it that in order to build a lasting business with the government, you have to actually have a billionaire on your founding team? The answer is contract cycles. It turns out that a government contract cycle is longer than a venture capital fundraising cycle. And so in order to survive the lulls in your business, you have to have some form of funding, some form of capital that's going to carry you through incredibly long sales cycles. And so this was like part of the strategy that I realized we had to have. We had to be able to raise a ton of money at really high valuations in order to keep the company basically afloat while we were waiting for everything to pick up.
But you would think, the Defense Department has a $700 billion a year budget. You would think that more companies or more people in Silicon Valley would say, I want a piece of that. Why do you think that founders are reluctant to work with government?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of reasons. Most of them are economical. It's just a question of, does it make sense to build a business in this space given how hard it is and how little most people know about it? So there's that piece of it. And then there's the government reason. So I think there are a lot of companies that get started that want to do business with the Defense Department, but the Defense Department doesn't know how to do business with them. Mm-hmm. And so even if they intend to do that work, they end up washing out of it very, very quickly once they realize that it's just not a good business model. The best example of this is that, I'm constantly at the Pentagon having these conversations with people about innovation, and they love telling me about how much they enjoy doing work with small business. And as a venture capitalist, I have to remind them that I don't like small businesses. I don't want all of my investments to be small businesses. I want them to be large businesses, which means that I need you, the government, to want to do business with large businesses that are new entrants to the market. And so they're really good at writing these like $50,000 or $250,000 checks, but they're really exceptionally bad at concentrating investment into the things that are working.
So that's interesting because I think a lot of people talk about the length of the sales cycle, and when you look at enterprise, traditional enterprise deals, those are long sales cycles as well. So you're saying it's not just the length of the sales cycle that makes it hard, it's also just the DNA of Defense Department not wanting to deploy that much capital or sign large contracts with what they consider to be a small business.
Yeah, I think that private sector enterprise sales are really hard, and I don't want to discount that. But I think that the incentive structures are different with the government in ways that make it significantly harder than that. Yeah. The easiest kind of encapsulation of this is around budgets. So in Washington, D.C., if you are a decision maker, the power that you have is the primary metric for how well you're doing in your career, and that power is directly connected to budget. So you're never going to get paid that much money compared to other industries, so it can't be your salary that matters. Your title is letters and numbers generally, so it's like, are you a GS-12, are you a GS-15, are you SES? And so that's not really like a great lever. And so the way people think about their power is how much budget they have control of. Now the problem with this is that budget in government is something that you either spend it or you lose it. And let's say you have a $100 million budget. If you spend $90 million, next year you get $90 million. Which basically means that you've lost power by underspending on your budget. And so everyone is incentivized to spend the full $100 million and request more, because that's how you get a bigger budget in the next year. So if a technology company with a product walks in the door and says, I can decrease your spend by 10x with a better capability, the mid-level that is leveraging themselves for promotions and increased budget is like, holy shit, that's a horrible idea because then I'll get less budget next year. And that's something that wouldn't happen in the private sector.
So people are not incentivized. Yeah, the private sector has the incentive to save money. Government doesn't necessarily.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, you and I both invest in deep tech companies, early stage deep tech companies, where government can actually be pretty helpful in helping a company have some revenue as they're looking for product market fit. How have you found working with government, early stage companies, how have companies succeeded in that? Through either OTAs or other vehicles that are more modern?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that you can get in with early contracts, usually smaller dollar amount contracts. There is a concept within the government. It is working really well within the Department of Defense right now, but it's actually applicable to a lot of different agencies. It's called an OTA, or an Other Transactional Authority. The government loves being very specific. Other Transactional Authority. And the OTA basically allows you to do a quick contract, like within 60 days, that is then sole source, which means you don't have to do a competitive bid in the follow-on year. So this is a pretty good mechanism, and is being used broadly by organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit down in Mountain View. You can also do SBIR, which are the research grants, that has a cap of $50,000 in the first year and then expands in further phases in later years. And the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, this guy named Will Roper, is starting to build this SBIR program that he calls credit card swipe contracts, where he'll issue you an SBIR grant in a single sitting. Like you come in, you give him a pitch, and he will give you $50,000 and an SBIR contract. So that's being scaled up. There's also organizations like Incutel, which is an equity investment vehicle that is managed by the CIA. That has investment dollars that are directly attached to pilot contracts. So if you get an investment from them, you also get a pilot with a government customer, which could have a much higher conversion rate than other mechanisms.
Yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit about building a team for government or for government sales, because it's very different than an enterprise team. What have you found over the last few years about how difficult or some surprises you found about building a team that's focused on government sales?
Yeah, I mean, the key here is that most people are wrong in what they think is true. So, Palantir and SpaceX found this out the hard way by guessing and testing a bunch of different models. But at the end of the day, they both sued the government and won. So they figured out that you can't just be friends. It's not about glad handing and going to all the right networking events. Sometimes you have to sue your customer. It's also this partnership model, you doing a very senior business development person that has done a bunch of complex partnering and subcontracting. Not a good model for building a startup. You want super aggressive people that are able to go in and just crank. Mm-hmm. And then I would say the third thing is technical skills. So, large organizations, government or enterprise, whether it's banking or insurance or whatever, are sold a lot of snake oil by salesmen. And so I think there's a real benefit to going in with technical expertise to actually be able to say, I'm telling you what the product is, and I know because I was part of building it. You can build traction a lot faster, which again is exactly what SpaceX and Palantir did with their sales teams.
Yeah. Now, Silicon Valley has a lot of misconceptions about how Washington works. And given all of the time that you've spent in Washington, I would love to hear some of the misconceptions that you've been trying to correct about how to get things done in Washington.
Well, I mean, some of them are really great, and some of them are still pretty greasy. One misconception is that people here believe that merit is generally rewarded. I actually don't think that's usually the case with the government. You actually do have to hire lobbyists to get anything done, which feels pretty gross, but is actually accurate. I think that there's also this misconception around how leadership is involved in decision making. So if you think about we all learned about this, all people that grew up in the US at least, learned about this in civics class, but there are three branches of government. There's executive, legislative, and judicial. None of these branches can act unilaterally. And so it turns out that the decisions that the president makes, good or bad, you can have your own opinion about that now, are not really able to be implemented unless the legislative and judiciary branch are not getting in the way. And so the reason you have to use lobbyists is that even if you had a direct presidential order that you had to execute on, Congress would still need to approve the budget for that thing. And the judiciary would have to agree that you weren't doing anything that was unconstitutional. And so I think it's really important to realize that there are all these moving pieces. There are checks and balances for a reason, and there are a lot of really good places and ways to interact with the government that have nothing to do with politics. These are not rhetoric or political issues at all. They're incredibly bipartisan, and it's just a matter of turning the cranks.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of talk recently about how Washington and Silicon Valley can work better together and the sorts of things that would need to change for that to happen. Would love to hear your view on something that Silicon Valley needs to do to better understand DC, and then vice versa. What does the Defense Department have to change about its procurement process or other processes to work better with us?
Yeah, I think on the government side, my expectation from them is twofold. The first is that they need to concentrate investments more efficiently. So instead of giving $250,000 checks to 400 companies, we need to figure out how we can start writing $10 million checks to 10 companies or $25 million checks to 4 companies so that you start getting more Palantirs and SpaceXs rather than just spray and pray investing in a way that we've clearly demonstrated doesn't work. The second thing is cultural. It's like attaching a program outcome to a person and like holding that person accountable for getting it done, which is not something that's happening right now. On the Silicon Valley side, I think like the thing that they need to be reminded of is that the government is gigantic. There are literally millions of people working for the government in a variety of different organizations. And again, these organizations are by and large not political. They're just everyday people doing everyday things that are important for making the world work. Like we need people that are working on roads. We need people that are working on Medicare, Medicaid. We need people that are working on defense. We need people that are working on disaster response. Like there's so many things going on. And I engage in a lot of conversations in Silicon Valley where people are like, politics drives everything. And like, if I don't agree with the person in the White House, I'm not going to get involved at all. Well, you're basically signing your own death warrant by doing this because you're saying none of the services that are delivered from my taxpayer dollars are important enough for me to care about if I don't like the one person in the White House. And that is it's just not a good approach to having a functional economy.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit to regulation. Most investors, I think, in Silicon Valley, and if you've had these experiences, regulation is a dirty word. People do not want to invest in highly regulated industries, but there's few firms, our firms included, that are very excited about regulation. Would love to hear why you've historically invested in highly regulated industries and why you think it can be good for business.
Yeah, so I think regulated industries tend to be much larger than non-regulated industries. There's a reason why they become regulated. It's because they're huge and they impact a lot of different parts of society. So that's the first thing, is that they tend to be really large markets. The second thing is that while a regulatory body can be a barrier to entry, it can also be a moat around existing business. And so it might be really hard to break in, but once you're in and there's a regulatory body that surrounds you, the stickiness is really high. So it's very hard to displace companies that make it into that. And you see this kind of, the SpaceX example is interesting because of news that came out today. But SpaceX was basically being blocked from bidding on, I think it was 36 national security launches that were owned by a monopoly of a syndicate of Lockheed, Raytheon, and Boeing, I think called ULA, the United Launch Alliance. SpaceX sued them to get access to something around 18 of those 36 contracts. And they won that lawsuit. They ended up getting access. And then just today, the Air Force Inspector General is like backtracking on this and basically investigating whether or not they should be allowed to bid. And so this is like what ULA has done. ULA has effectively set up a moat around their business, and they spend a lot of lobbying money trying to prevent anyone else from touching that business, even if it means like, I'm not saying this is happening, but it could be happening that the IG at the Air Force is going to get a job at Boeing. And so it would be really incentivized to do everything they could to ensure that that moat remains stable.
Mm-hmm. So once you get to a certain point, say you're a startup, like SpaceX, still a startup, still a private company and smaller than a lot of the companies they're bidding against, but has the manpower, has the lobbyist, has sort of the aggressive person at the front of it that's willing to sue government if they're not going to act appropriately.
Totally. Like if you are really serious about this, I would encourage you to just hire a lobbyist as soon as possible.
And on that note, I mean, there's probably a lot of founders in the room today that maybe didn't think about working with government or hadn't thought about government sales. What is your one piece of advice to them as they're on their journey in terms of if they want to go after these contracts, what they should do?
Find a billionaire co-founder. Aside from that, which is probably pretty hard to do, I think be very skeptical of advice from former government people. Keep in mind that the people that you think are going to be able to give you advice have never started anything before. They have worked inside of government. If you're a general, that means that you've been in the military for like 25 plus years. Like, it seems very strange to me that startup Startups like list generals on their advisory board. It's like, what are they advising you on? Like, this doesn't make any sense. They have no idea what you're doing any more than you know what they did during their career. So seek advice from the right places and be very skeptical of people who purport to be experts.
Thanks so much for joining us, Trae.
Sure.